the Panhandle's most trusted, balanced, and accurate newscast. With Lisa Schmidt, with Jay Ritchie, and sports with Lee Baker. Weather with Storm Surge 7 meteorologist Brian James. You're watching Pro News 7 at 6.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Pro News 7 at 6. Our newscast is a special edition this evening, part of our series of Pro News 7 talk programs. Jay Ritchie is standing by on the other side of the studio with tonight's special guest. Jay?
Thank you, Lisa. That special guest is Panhandle Congressman Mac Thornberry. Congressman, thank you very much for being here with us this evening.
You're most welcome.
We have two topics to talk about tonight. That's gun control and the debt ceiling, and we only have 8.5 minutes, so I want to jump right to it right away and not waste any time. A couple of weeks ago, Congressman, we had a show here, The Gun Talk, where we had questions submitted by our viewers and threw them at a panel of 3 people. I want to repeat those questions with you to see where you stand on them. The opening question, parts of the gun control package that are likely to be passed by Congress, what do you think? What portions of these restrictions may pass, which ones are doomed, why, and where do you stand on things like clip size and more background checks?
Yeah. I think it's unlikely that Congress will pass any of the proposals that President Obama has put forward in legislation. We were going to have hearings, I think, in both the House and Senate, explore some of these issues. Can improvements be made in background checks, et cetera? But as far as restricting ammunition, restricting the kinds of weapons, universal background checks, I don't think those are going to happen, and I don't think they should happen.
And why shouldn't they happen? There's enough outcry from the victims of these crimes across the country, and there's enough backlash from people who I think in the latest polls say they want something to be done. Why will nothing be done?
Oh, I think it's completely understandable that we see a tragedy like the school shooting in Connecticut and say we've got to do something about that. But yet, if you look at the things that the president has proposed, there's not a one of them that would have made a difference in that case. I mean, just remember what happened here. This young man shot his mother in bed, stole her weapons that she had bought legally, and then went to a gun-free zone, shooting his way into the school, killing innocent people before killing himself. None of those things would have been altered by any of these proposals. And as a matter of fact, the people talk about assault weapons bans. That is only about the way a weapon looks, not about how it functions. And so a lot of this is a natural desire to just do something without using a common sense test to say, would it matter? And that's before we ever get to the discussion about the Second Amendment and the protections that it gives for all of us.
So much there. The school issue, the gun-free zone issue, that came up during our show. There have been decisions in many states and districts about allowing teachers and janitorial staff and those kind of people to go through training, get the guns, and have them in the schools in case an attack should happen. On the one hand, there's a theory that perhaps the answer to this whole question is more guns. On the other side is we're maybe letting a problematic gun culture get even more out of control in this country. There's the two sides. Where do you balance those things out?
Primarily with Washington staying out of it. I think that's got to be a local decision. What makes sense for that school? Some places may be able to hire an armed guard. Some places may want to give a teacher a gun. But local control of schools is absolutely essential, and I don't think Washington should get into it. And the other point to make is sometimes we hear a lot about gun culture. There's a lot more in our culture going on here that leads to some of these horrible incidents than just the existence of guns. And we've got to focus on a range of issues, not just the piece of metal and plastic that happens to be used in a particular case.
Well, about those pieces, one issue that came up was we talked about a pea shooter on one side and a grenade launcher on the other, and we talk about the right to have a weapon, the right to have a weapon to protect myself and my family. Do I have the right to own any weapon, or is there some kind of middle ground for what I'm allowed to have in my house? Yeah,
you're not allowed to have any weapon. Most people don't even know that automatic weapons have been illegal since about the 1930s in this country. So sometimes the names that are associated with these things get skewed. But I think the best guide is to look at the First Amendment. You are not authorized to say anything you want in any place you want. There are some guidelines for that make sense, but that protect your right to free speech. The Second Amendment, I'd suggest, has similar things. There are guidelines. You're not entitled to have a grenade launcher in your backyard, but what is consistent with the rights that the Second Amendment is seeking to protect? And I'd suggest it is not just about hunting. It's also about your right to protect and defend your family and yourself. Yeah,
we talked about Second Amendment. A lady wrote, what happened to my right to make sure that my kids are safe when they get to school in the morning? Okay, do I have that right in addition to your right to have a gun?
Yeah. Well, obviously, we all want a society where our children are safe. And we also want a society where our children are not subjected to horrible lyrics and movies and things like that. But the First Amendment makes some guarantees there. And there's some regulations about children being able to, and I'd say, again, look at the First Amendment on what makes sense for the Second Amendment. The Founding Fathers put them 1 and 2 for a good reason.
As you've mentioned, Washington controlling all that stuff is not the way we should go.
Well, it's sure not the right way to control schools, absolutely. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled that the Second Amendment is an individual right. It's not just about militias marching, out on the parade ground. It's an individual right, and that is something that is different from the last time there was an assault weapons ban passed in the Clinton administration.
Let's turn the page. Debt ceiling. Last Wednesday, the House approved legislation that temporarily suspends the requirement to approve a debt ceiling. Where's the legislation now? Senate's going to get it next. When is that going to happen, and is the President still likely to sign that?
The President said he would sign it. The Senate has indicated they would pass it, but until the Senate actually does something, I don't believe it. Hopefully it'll happen sometime this week. This is just essentially a temporary measure, but one of the things it tries to make sure is that there is actually a budget passed. The Senate has not passed a budget in 4 years. This bill says that if either the House or the Senate doesn't pass a budget, then that body's member pay is withheld until they do. And that's kind of gimmicky, I understand, but we're looking for something to make the Senate do its job, and that's what we came up with. And it passed with bipartisan support.
I know a lot of people are talking about it's a Band-Aid measure, it's a stopgap measure. Why don't you go the whole hog and get this thing done now?
Because to deal with the problem, we're going to have to put the whole budget on the table. We're going to have to look at all spending, and especially we're going to have to look at that spending that's called mandatory or entitlement spending, which is 2/3 of the budget. And so the idea is we've got a number of key decisions to make with deadlines: the sequestration, the across-the-board cuts, the continuing resolution that funds the government, the budget, and then the debt ceiling again, all within the next 3 months. We need to have a conversation about dealing with the whole problem, not just another one of these kind of showdowns with the president that doesn't really resolve anything.
Nobody understands or can even concept of all the trillions of dollars we're talking about in this debt ceiling. What does that number and where we are right now do for America's spending power and investments and inflation, those kinds of things?
Well, it affects everything. And let's just put it this way. Every year for the past 4 years, we have borrowed $1 trillion just to pay for federal spending. That cannot continue. That it is such an enormous amount of money with interest rates low. Remember what happens if interest rates go up just a little bit. It just blows what federal budget there is apart. So we have got to get a handle on the whole federal budget, and that means a focus on spending, especially the 2/3 of spending that is on automatic pilot that Congress never votes on. That's what we hope to try to deal with and begin to deal with in the next 3 months.
I serve on a couple of nonprofit boards. We talked the last couple of weeks about, oh my gosh, where is the money that we can do our work here in the Panhandle going to come from if we have these freezes and these limits and all those things going on? Do you have any assurances for nonprofits right now?
I think all federal spending is going to have to be examined, and that includes defense spending, which I think is the first job of the federal government, but it's going to be tight for everybody. It just has to be. We have dug ourselves such an enormous hole of debt that we're going to have to look at all spending, even good spending that goes for good purposes. We're going to have to look at all of that if we're going to get our way out of it.
Quickest 8.5 minutes I've had in the last couple of weeks. So, Congressman, thanks very much for being with us once again.
You bet, Jay.
Brian James has your forecast coming up next.